Harlan Voss pressed the lit end of his cigar against the back of the child's hand and watched her flinch without making a sound. She had learned not to make sounds. That was the first thing she had learned in his house. He leaned down until his face was inches from hers and said, very quietly, "You belong to me. You will always belong to me. And if you ever try to run again, I will make sure there is nowhere left for you to run to." Then he smiled, the same smile the town of Dillon saw every Sunday, the same smile that hung in the county commissioner's office in a framed photograph, the same smile that had never once cost him a single thing. Lily Carter was 4 years old. She had not cried in 6 months. She had forgotten how. If this story already has your heart in your throat, hit that like button, drop your city or country in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. The worst is not over, and neither is the fight. Wow. The wind came down off the Bighorn Mountains the way it always did in December. Not gradually, not with any kind of warning, but all at once, like something had broken loose up there and decided to punish everything below. It drove snow sideways across the valley floor and pushed through every gap in every wall in Calhoun County, Wyoming, and it did not care who you were or what you had built or how long you had managed to keep the cold out. Caleb Hargrove had been awake since 3 in the morning. That wasn't unusual. Sleep had never been reliable, not in the 6 years since Thomas died, and not in the 4 years since he'd turned in his federal marshal's badge and told his supervisor exactly where he could file the paperwork. He'd been awake since 3, sitting in the chair by the wood stove with a cup of coffee that had gone cold before he'd taken 2 sips, listening to the wind work against the shutters and thinking about absolutely nothing. That was the trick he'd learned. Think about nothing. Think about the sound of the fire. Think about the grain of the floorboards. Think about anything small enough that it didn't have room to hurt you. He was 44 years old, and he lived alone on 160 acres of frozen ground, 12 miles from the nearest town, and that was exactly what he had decided he deserved. The scratching started at 12 past midnight. He heard it before he understood what it was, a faint, irregular sound from the direction of the front door, barely audible under the wind. His first thought was an animal, coyote maybe, or a dog that had gotten lost and wandered up from the road. He sat still and listened, and the scratching came again, slightly more urgent, and then he heard something that was not an animal. It was a sound so small he almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. A child's sound. Not quite a cry. Too exhausted to be a cry. More like the sound a person makes when they have already used up every other option, and this is the last one, and they know it. Caleb was out of the chair before he'd made any conscious decision to move. He crossed the room in 4 steps and pulled the front door open, and the wind hit him like a flat board across the chest. And standing there in the snow, no coat, no shoes, wearing a cotton dress that was completely wrong for December, or for any month with temperatures below freezing, was a child. She was small. Smaller than she should have been, he thought immediately. The way you think things like that before you know why you're thinking them. Dark hair plastered to her face from the snow, skin so pale it was almost blue around the lips. She looked up at him with eyes that were too old for a face that young, eyes that had clearly already done the math on whether trusting another adult was worth the risk, and he could see her deciding something. She lifted her right hand and held it up toward him. He didn't understand at first what she was showing him. Then he saw the burn. "Come here," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. She didn't move. "You don't have to," he said, and he crouched down to her level, which put his knees in 4 inches of snow, and he didn't care. "But I'm going to leave this door open either way because it's warmer in here than out there." She looked at him for 3 more seconds, then she walked inside. He grabbed the wool blanket off the back of the couch, the old one, the one that had belonged to his mother, and wrapped it around her before she'd made it 3 steps into the room. She went rigid at his touch, the way an animal goes rigid when it expects pain, and he backed off immediately and held his hands where she could see them. "Just the blanket," he said. "That's all. You can hold it yourself." She pulled it tighter around her shoulders and stood there looking at the wood stove, and he could see her body starting to shake as the warmth hit her. That was a good sign. Shaking was better than not shaking. He'd seen enough cold exposure in his years working the territory to know when a person's body had given up on generating heat and when it hadn't. "What's your name?" he asked, keeping his voice flat and unthreatening. He moved to the kitchen because doing something with his hands seemed like the right instinct. He put milk in a pot on the stove. No answer. "Mine's Caleb," he said. "This is my ranch. The road out there is Hargrove Road, if that means anything to you." Still nothing. She was staring at the fire. "You don't have to tell me anything," he said. "You don't owe me anything. But that milk's going to be warm in a minute, and I've got bread that's not completely stale yet, and you're welcome to both." He heard the smallest sound from behind him. He didn't turn around. "Lily," she said. Barely a word. More like the memory of a word. "Lily," he repeated. "Okay. Good. That's a good name." He poured the milk when it was warm out, not hot. He'd known a child who'd burned her mouth on hot milk once, and the memory of that sound had stayed with him, and set it on the kitchen table with a slice of bread and a little dish of butter. He sat down across from her and folded his hands on the table and waited. She ate like someone who hadn't eaten in 2 days, methodically, almost silently. She held the bread with both hands, and she kept glancing at the door the way animals do when they're still calculating the exit, and he noticed that she never once turned her back to the room. "How old are you?" he asked. She held up 4 fingers without looking at him. 4, he said. "All right." He paused. "Where did you come from, Lily?" She lowered her hand. She looked at the table. Then she said something so quietly he had to lean forward to catch it. "He always comes looking." The back of Caleb's neck went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. "Who does?" he said. She didn't answer. She was staring at the door. He got up, not quickly, not in a way that would startle her, and walked to the door and turned the heavy iron lock. Then he came back and sat down and said, "Nobody's coming through that door tonight. I need you to believe me." She looked at him for a long moment with those old, careful eyes. Then she looked back at her bread. He noticed her feet when she shifted position on the chair. The soles were cut in multiple places. She'd been walking through snow barefoot long enough that the cold had done some of the work of numbing the pain, but not all of it. He noticed the bruising above her left collarbone where it showed above the neckline of the dress. He noticed the way she favored her left arm, keeping it slightly against her body. He noticed the burn on the back of her right hand again. He had spent 16 years as a federal marshal. He had worked child welfare cases. He had testified in court about what men with money and influence were capable of doing behind closed doors. He had thought, when he retired, that he had put all of that behind him. Looking at Lily Carter, he understood that some things do not stay behind. "I'm going to get the kit I use for horses," he said. "When somebody gets a cut on their feet, the medicine I've got is the same kind a doctor would use. It's just that I buy it for the horse because it's cheaper that way." He stood up carefully. "Is it all right if I look at your feet?" She thought about it. Then she nodded, very slightly. He got the tin box from the shelf in the back room, the one with the iodine and the bandage cloth and the small pair of scissors, and came back and crouched down and examined her feet the way he examined an injured animal's, with patience and without comment. She made no sound while he worked, not one. He wanted very badly to ask her how she had learned to be that quiet, and he did not ask because he already knew the answer. "There," he said when he was done. He sat back on his heels. "How does that feel?" "Better," she said. First full word she'd given him. He nodded. He stood up. He looked around the room and made the kind of calculations a man makes when his world changes without warning. The ranch had 2 bedrooms. He slept in the smaller one. The larger one had been Thomas's, and he had not opened the door to it in 5 years. Tonight, he decided, that was going to change. "I'm going to make up a bed for you," he said, "and I'm going to sit in the chair out here while you sleep. So if you wake up, you can see me and you can see the door, all right?" She looked at him. "You don't have to trust me," he said. "You don't know me. But I'm going to tell you one thing that's true, and I want you to decide for yourself whether you believe it." He looked her in the eye. "I'm not going to let anybody take you out of this house tonight." She was quiet for a long time. The fire popped. Wind threw itself at the shutters and moved on. "Okay," she said. He turned toward the hallway. He put his hand on the door of the room he hadn't entered in 5 years, and he stood there for just a moment because some things are still hard even when you know they're right. Then he opened it. The room smelled like dust and old wool and the particular absence that belongs to the people who are no longer in them. He stripped the bed and remade it with clean sheets from the trunk at the foot, and he put the extra quilt on top because it was cold. He did it efficiently and without thinking about it too much, because if he thought about it too much, it would take too long. He brought Lily down the hallway and showed her the room and watched her stand in the doorway for a moment looking at the bed like she was trying to figure out if it was safe. "Nobody's taken this room in a while," he said. "But it's clean. I just changed the sheets." She walked in. She climbed up onto the bed, still wrapped in the wool blanket, and lay down on top of the quilt. And for the first time since she'd appeared in his doorway, something shifted in her face. Just slightly. Just enough that he caught it. She was scared. She was still scared. But she was scared, and she was warm, and those were two different things. "I'll be right outside," he said. "Okay," she said. He left the door open a crack and went back to his chair and sat down. He picked up his cold coffee and put it back down and looked at the fire. Outside, the wind was still working. The clock on the wall said 12:47. He sat there and turned what he knew over in his mind, the way he used to turn a case over, looking at the edges, looking for what didn't fit. A 4-year-old child, barefoot in December, no coat, a burn on her hand that was not an accident. He had seen enough accidental burns to know the difference, and this was not one. Bruising that was more than a single event. Cuts on her feet that suggested she had been walking for a long time before she found his door. And the things she'd said. He always comes looking. He always. Not they. Not someone. He. A specific man. A man she expected to come after her, expected it with the certainty of a child who has been caught before. Caleb had been out of the law for 4 years. He had made a deliberate decision to not know people's business in Calhoun County, to not involve himself, to not become the person who found things out and then had to decide what to do about them. He had moved here for the land and the quiet and the merciful isolation of 12 miles of dirt road between himself and other people's problems. That was what he had decided. And sitting in his chair at 12:47 in the morning with a hurt 4-year-old girl sleeping in the room at the end of the hall, he understood that what he had decided was now irrelevant. He leaned forward and stoked the fire and settled back into his chair and stayed awake until morning. At first light, he walked to the barn and found Marcus Reed already there, which was not unusual. Marcus had been working this ranch for 3 years, and he had the particular quality of early risers who arrive before you notice them and stay after you've stopped looking. Marcus was 51, built like a man who had done physical work every day of his adult life, and he had the kind of face that didn't give much away until it gave everything away. He looked up from the harness he was mending when Caleb came in and said, "Morning?" and then looked at Caleb's face and said, "What happened?" "I need to ask you something," Caleb said. "All right. You've lived in this county your whole life. 41 years. Who runs it?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. He set the harness down. "You mean the whole county, or you mean who actually runs it?" "Second one." Marcus looked at him steadily. "Why are you asking me this now?" "Because there's a 4-year-old girl in my house with a cigar burn on her hand, and she told me somebody's coming looking for her." The silence in the barn was very complete. A horse shifted in the nearest stall. Somewhere in the rafters, something small moved. Marcus said, "Harlan Voss." Caleb had heard the name. You couldn't be in Calhoun County for 4 years and not hear Harlan Voss's name. He owned the largest cattle operation in the county and 3/4 of the commercial property in Dillon, and he had a seat on the county commission, and he gave money to the school, and he appeared in the newspaper on the occasion of every ribbon cutting and every public gathering, and he was, by all visible accounts, the kind of man a community builds a story around, the kind of man who becomes part of how a town explains itself to itself. "Voss," Caleb said. "He's got a child," Marcus said slowly. "A ward, is what people say. Little girl. Nobody sees her much. He doesn't bring her to town events or church socials or anything like that. He just has her." Marcus looked at his hands. "I heard once from a woman whose cousin worked out at his place that the girl came to him from somewhere east. No family. He took her in. He paused. That's what people say. What do people not say? Marcus was quiet for another moment. They don't say what happens at that ranch, because nobody who works out there stays long enough to say anything, and the ones who leave, they leave quiet. Caleb looked at him. Voss knows the sheriff. Wade Parker wouldn't cross Harlan Voss if you paid him his weight in gold. Parker's been in that office 12 years. Voss put him there. Caleb nodded once. He looked at the far wall of the barn and worked through things methodically the way he always had. What he knew, what he didn't know, what he needed to find out. I'm going to need a doctor, he said. Not from town if I can avoid it. Somebody I can trust. Evelyn Shaw, Marcus said immediately. She's got a practice over in Millbridge. 40-minute ride. She's not in Voss's pocket. She came out from back east a few years ago, set up independently. Doesn't owe Dylan anything. He hesitated. And she's good. The real kind of good. Can you ride to Millbridge today? I can go now. Caleb nodded. Don't say anything about the girl. Say a ranch hand had an accident. I want the doctor here before Voss hears anything. Marcus picked up his coat from the hook on the stall post. He stopped at the barn door. Caleb, he said, you understand that once Voss knows she's here, this isn't going to be quiet. He's not going to send a letter. I know, Caleb said. He's going to send Parker, and if Parker doesn't work, he'll find another way. I know, Caleb said again. Marcus looked at him for a moment with that face that didn't give things away. Then he walked out into the cold morning, and Caleb heard him saddling up. And then he heard the horse move out of the yard. And then there was just the sound of the wind and the animals and the work of the day. He went back to the house. He checked the room. Lily was still asleep, curled under the quilt with only the top of her head showing. He stood in the doorway for a moment, not long enough to wake her, and then went to the kitchen and started making breakfast. He had 2 eggs and some salt pork and cornbread from 2 days ago that was still edible if you warmed it, and he made it all quietly and set the table for 2 and waited. He heard her before he saw her. Small footsteps on the floorboards of the hallway, then a pause, then more footsteps. She appeared in the kitchen doorway in the wool blanket and looked at him and then looked at the table. I made breakfast, he said. She came and sat down. She looked at the plate in front of her with an expression that was very close to suspicion and very close to something else. What is it? He asked. She shook her head. She picked up the fork. They ate in silence. He didn't try to fill it. He had learned long ago that silence has different qualities. There is the kind that is comfortable, and the kind that is watchful, and the kind that is exhausted. And what sat between them now was the watchful kind, which he respected. After a while, she said, without looking up, Where is this place? My ranch, he said, Hargrove Ranch, about 12 miles from Dillon. She nodded, like she was filing it away. Do you know Dillon? He asked. Another small nod. How long were you walking last night? She thought about it. A long time, she said. He did the math in his head. Voss's operation, the main house and the outbuildings, was, if he remembered correctly, somewhere north of the county road, maybe 8 miles on foot if you knew the direct route. A 4-year-old, barefoot in December, in the dark. He kept his face very still. That was brave, he said. She looked up at him. She seemed unsure what to do with the word. I mean it, he said. That took a lot of grit. She went back to her eggs. After another moment, she said very quietly, He's going to be angry. Maybe so, Caleb said. He gets very angry when I do things he doesn't want. I expect he does. She put her fork down and looked at him directly for the first time since she'd woken up. Are you scared of him? Caleb thought about how to answer that the way you think about how to answer a child, not talking down, not lying, not performing false confidence. I know the kind of man he is, he said. I spent a lot of years dealing with that kind of man, and I'm telling you right now because I want you to hear this clearly. A man like that is only powerful until somebody decides he isn't. He met her eyes. I've made that decision. She stared at him. Then she picked up her fork again. They were still sitting there when he heard the sound of hooves coming up the road, and his hand was on his feet and at the front window, before he'd registered moving. But it was Marcus, and there was a rider with him. A woman, medium height, a medical bag hanging from her saddle. And Caleb let out the breath he'd been holding and went to put the coffee on. Dr. Evelyn Shaw was not what he'd expected, though he couldn't have said what he'd expected. She was somewhere in her early 40s with dark eyes that moved quickly and took inventory of everything in a room within the first 10 seconds of being in it. She shook his hand with a firm, brief grip, looked at Marcus, looked around the kitchen, and then looked at Lily. Something shifted in her expression. She crouched down to Lily's level immediately, not making a big gesture of it, just naturally reducing herself to the right height, and said, "Hi, I'm Evelyn. Are you Lily?" Lily looked at her. "I'm a doctor," Evelyn said, "which means my job is to help people feel better. And I brought some peppermint candies in my bag, which has nothing to do with my job, but which I find makes introductions go more smoothly." She produced one from her coat pocket and set it on the table without making a production of it. Lily looked at the candy, then she looked at Evelyn. "You ride a horse," she said. "I do," Evelyn said. "Her name is Bess, and she is extremely opinionated about everything." The corner of Lily's mouth moved, just barely, but it moved. Caleb stepped back and let Evelyn do her work, which she did with the efficiency and quietness of someone who understood that she was navigating more than just medical territory. She examined Lily's feet, her hands, her arms, the bruising above her collarbone. She asked questions in a steady, ordinary voice, and Lily answered some of them and not others, and Evelyn accepted both responses with equal calm. After 20 minutes, she stood up and came to where Caleb was standing near the wood stove, and her face told him what she'd found before she said a word of it. "The burn is deliberate," she said, quietly enough that Lily couldn't hear. "Minimum 2 weeks old, possibly 3. The bruising on the shoulder is consistent with significant force, more than a fall. There are older marks on her left arm that have healed improperly." She paused. "This has been happening for a while." "How long is a while?" "I can't say precisely, but the pattern of healing on the older injuries. Months, at least." Caleb looked at the floor. He looked up. "Can you document it?" "I already started." She held up a small notebook. "Written record, sketches of each injury with relative location. I can put this in a formal medical report when I get back to Millbridge. Signed, dated, with my professional credentials." She looked at him steadily. "Do you mind telling me what you're planning to do with it?" "Everything I can," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "I need you to know something," she said. "I've seen this before. Not here, but before. And the man who did it, he was respected. He had friends in the right offices. The first 2 times I tried to do something, the documentation disappeared. The witnesses stopped talking." Her jaw tightened slightly. "The 3rd time, I didn't stop." "What happened the 3rd time?" "He's in a federal prison in Ohio," she said. "I learned that documentation alone isn't enough. You need people. You need the kind of people who won't break." "I'm working on that," Caleb said. She held his gaze another moment, and then she nodded. She went back to the table where Lily was sitting, and she said, "I'm going to leave some medicine for Mr. Hargrove to put on your feet, and a bandage for your hand. And when those peppermint candies are gone, which I'm giving you all of them right now, you should know they grow on a farm outside of Millbridge, and I get a new supply every month." Lily looked at her. "You're coming back?" "I am," Evelyn said. And she said it the way people say things that are facts, not promises, because facts are more reliable. She left with Marcus at 10:15, and Caleb stood on the porch and watched them go down the road, and he was still watching when they disappeared behind the tree line and the road was empty again. He turned and went inside. Lily was at the kitchen table, both hands wrapped around the mug he'd given her. Warm water with a little honey, the closest thing to a treat he had in the house. She was looking out the window the way she'd looked at the door the previous night. "What are you watching for?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. But she didn't stop watching. He understood. She had every right to keep watching. He always comes looking. That was what she told him, and a child that age doesn't say something like that unless she has evidence. Caleb went to his desk in the back room and opened the drawer where he kept the things he'd told himself he wouldn't need again. The notebook he'd kept case notes in, the maps of the county, the list of names he'd accumulated over his years in the territory. He set them on the desk and sat down. He opened the notebook to a fresh page. He wrote Harlan Voss at the top. Then he started writing everything else. By mid-morning, Caleb had 3 pages of notes and a very clear picture of how much he didn't know. He knew Voss's name. He knew the rough location of his operation, north of the county road, somewhere past the Granger Creek cutoff, land that Caleb had never had reason to visit. He knew that Voss sat on the county commission and that Sheriff Wade Parker was, as Marcus had put it, not a man who would cross him. He knew that Lily had been in that house for an unknown period of time and that what had happened to her there had been happening long enough to leave marks that had healed and scarred and healed again. What he didn't know was how far Voss's reach actually extended. He didn't know what legal claim, if any, Voss held over Lily. He didn't know whether there were other people at that ranch who might talk, or whether they had already been bought or frightened into silence. And he didn't know how much time he had before someone showed up on his road. He was still working through it when he heard Lily's feet on the floor behind him. She stood in the doorway of the back room with her hands folded in front of her and looked at what he was doing with an expression he couldn't immediately read. Then she said, "Are you writing about him?" "I am," he said. "He doesn't like it when people write things down," she said. "He made Mrs. Alderman burn a book once." Caleb put his pen down. He turned in his chair to face her fully. "What kind of book?" Lily thought about it. "A little one. She kept it in her apron pocket. He found it, and he said she didn't have any business writing things down in his house, and she had to burn it in the kitchen stove." She paused. She cried, but not in front of him, after. "Who was Mrs. Alderman?" "She took care of me," Lily said. "She made my breakfast and helped me wash my hair. She had a son in Colorado." She looked at the floor. "She left in September. He told her she wasn't needed anymore." Another pause, slightly longer. "I don't think she wanted to go." Caleb held very still. "Lily, can you remember Mrs. Alderman's first name, or the son's name in Colorado?" She thought hard. The concentration on her face was visible and genuine, the kind of effort a 4-year-old makes when they understand that something matters. "Ruth," she said finally. "Her name was Ruth, and I think the son was called Danny." She looked up. "I heard her say his name once when she didn't know I was listening. She was talking to the window." He wrote both names down. Then he wrote September, dismissed, and kept a private journal and drew a line connecting them. It wasn't much, but it was a thread, and threads were how cases started. "You're very observant," he told her. She seemed to consider that. "He didn't like it," she said. "He said I noticed things I shouldn't." "Well," Caleb said carefully, "in my experience, the people who notice things they're not supposed to are usually the most dangerous ones in the room." She looked at him for a moment. Then she walked to the chair in the corner of the room, the old reading chair, the one with the cracked leather arm, and climbed into it and pulled her knees up and sat there watching him work. She didn't ask any more questions. She just stayed. He didn't tell her to leave. Marcus came back at noon with supplies from his own place. Extra flour, 2 jars of preserved peaches, a coat that had belonged to his youngest daughter before she grew out of it. He dropped them on the kitchen table without ceremony and looked at Lily sitting in the corner eating a biscuit Caleb had made, and his face did the thing it did when it was giving everything away instead of nothing. "Any word?" Caleb asked him, low enough. "Not yet," Marcus said. "But I stopped at the Miller place on the way back. Tom Miller's oldest boy saw riders going toward the county road this morning. Early. Before light. He poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter. Couldn't say who they were." Caleb looked at him. "Could be anything," Marcus said. "Could be," Caleb agreed, and they both understood they were not talking about anything. After lunch, Lily tried on the coat Marcus had brought. It was a little too big, which meant the sleeves covered her hands, which she seemed to find acceptable. She stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked at her arms inside the oversized sleeves, and then looked at Marcus. "Thank you," she said. Marcus nodded, and his voice, when he answered, was slightly different than usual. "Fits pretty good," he said, which was not true but was the right thing to say. It was mid-afternoon when Caleb heard the horses. Not the sound of one horse on the road, which would have been innocuous, 3 horses, maybe 4, moving at a pace that was deliberate and unhurried, which was in some ways worse than fast. Fast meant urgency, and urgency could mean error. Deliberate meant confidence. It meant men who were not worried about what was waiting for them. He went to the front window first. 3 riders, coming up Hargrove Road from the direction of the county road. In front was a man in a tan coat and a county sheriff's star, who Caleb had seen exactly twice before at a distance and recognized as Wade Parker. Behind him, 2 men Caleb didn't recognize. Bigger, sitting their horses the way hired men sit horses when they've been told to look like something more than hired men. Caleb turned from the window. Marcus was already in the room. "Take her to the back bedroom," Caleb said, "the one at the end. Stay in there with her." Marcus looked at him once, the way a man looks at someone when he wants to ask a question and knows there's no time for it. Then he went to Lily, who had already sensed something and was standing in the hallway with her arms pulled inside the coat sleeves, and he said, "Come on, let's go look at those horses in the back pasture." And he took her down the hall. Caleb checked the rifle above the door out of habit, not intention. He wasn't going to use it, not today, not like this. But the habit was 16 years deep, and it ran without asking permission. He opened the front door before Parker reached the porch steps. Wade Parker was a heavy-set man in his mid-50s with a thick gray mustache and the kind of easy authority that came from being the biggest power in a small room for a long time. He stopped his horse at the edge of the porch and looked at Caleb with an expression that was working hard to stay neutral. "Hargrove," he said. "Sheriff," Caleb said, "mind if I step down?" "Go ahead." Parker got off his horse and came up the 2 porch steps and stopped at the door because Caleb hadn't moved from it. The 2 men behind stayed on their horses. One of them had his hands resting on the saddle horn in a way that was either casual or practiced, and was probably both. "I'll get right to it," Parker said. "We've had a report of a missing child. Harlan Voss's ward. Little girl, about 4 years old. Dark hair, apparently left the property sometime overnight." He paused. "Happened to disappear in the general direction of your place." "Happened to," Caleb said. Parker's expression didn't change. "You seen anyone like that?" Caleb leaned against the doorframe. He looked at Parker with the particular quality of attention he had spent 16 years developing, the kind that makes a person aware they are being read very carefully. "Before I answer that, Sheriff," he said, "I want to understand something. You said Harlan Voss's ward. What's the legal documentation on that?" Parker blinked. Just once. But it was there. "I'm not sure that's relevant to—" "I think it's pretty relevant," Caleb said pleasantly. "A child without documented legal guardianship has a different status than a child with it, and a man with documented guardianship can produce those documents when asked, so I'm asking, does Voss have legal guardianship papers, or does he have something else?" Parker's jaw tightened slightly. "Mr. Hargrove, I'm not here to argue legal theory. I'm here about a missing child." "And I'm asking a reasonable question," Caleb said. "I spent 16 years as a federal marshal, Wade. I know what legal guardianship looks like, and I know what informal arrangements look like, and they have very different implications for what you're authorized to do and where." He straightened. "So, does he have papers?" The silence stretched. One of the horses behind Parker stamped at the cold ground. "There are documents," Parker said finally. "Informal arrangement is still being formalized." "Informal arrangement," Caleb said. He let the words sit there. "Hargrove." "I don't have the child," Caleb said. It was technically true. He didn't have her. Marcus had her. He held Parker's eyes when he said it. "And if you've got a warrant for a search of my property, I'd like to see it." Parker didn't move for a moment. He was doing the calculation. Caleb could see it happening, the weighing of how hard to push, what Voss would want, versus what he could actually accomplish standing on a porch in the December cold with no warrant and no legal documentation that would hold water. He was not, Caleb suspected, a stupid man. He was a compromised man, which was different. "I can get a warrant," Parker said. "You can certainly try," Caleb said. "And when you do, I'll be happy to cooperate with a lawful search. Until then." He nodded once, courteous and final. You have a safe ride back to town, Sheriff. Parker looked at him for another moment. Then he turned and went back down the steps and got on his horse, and the three of them turned back down Hargrove Road without a word. Caleb watched them until they were out of sight. Then he went inside and closed the door and put his back against it and breathed. His hands were steady. They'd always been steady. He'd never quite decided if that was a strength or something wrong with him. He went down the hall. He knocked twice on the back bedroom door and opened it. Marcus was sitting on the floor with his back against the bed. Lily was on the bed behind him, hugging the folded quilt, and when the door opened, she looked at Caleb with those eyes that did all their work before the rest of her face caught up. "They're gone," Caleb said. "Were they from him?" she asked. "Yes." She nodded like she'd already known. "He'll send more," she said. "Probably." "What are you going to do?" Caleb looked at her for a moment. "I'm going to make sure that when he does, I have more than they do." She seemed to think about that. Then she said, "Mrs. Alderman used to say that the only way to beat a man like him is to know more than he thinks you know." "Mrs. Alderman sounds like a smart woman," Caleb said. "She was," Lily said, and the past tense, the way a 4-year-old used it without realizing the weight of it, landed somewhere in Caleb's chest and stayed there. He spent the evening at his desk. He wrote down everything Lily had told him and everything he'd observed for himself and everything Marcus knew. And when he was done, he had 5 pages and the persistent sense that he was working from one end of a very large thing and couldn't yet see the shape of it. What he needed was someone who'd been inside Voss's operation. Someone who knew how it worked from the ground level, not the public image level. He thought about Ruth Alderman, a housekeeper, dismissed in September, who kept a private journal and had a son in Colorado named Danny. It wasn't much, but if she'd kept a journal, she'd been writing things down for a reason, and people who write things down usually have things worth writing. The question was finding her. He was still working on that problem the next morning when Marcus came in from the cold with snow on his hat and something different in his expression. "There's a woman at the gate," Marcus said. Caleb looked up. "What kind of woman?" "The kind that drove herself here in a wagon in December and looks like she'd rather be anywhere else, but also like she's not leaving until she's said what she came to say." Marcus paused. "She asked for you by name." Caleb got his coat. The woman at the gate was somewhere in her late 50s, plain dressed, with gray-streaked hair pulled back and hands that showed decades of work. She was sitting on the wagon seat with her shoulders up around her ears against the cold, and her expression was the complicated kind, fear and determination running alongside each other, neither one winning. "Mr. Hargrove," she said when he reached the gate. "That's right." "My name is Clara Whitlock," she said. "I used to work at Harlan Voss's ranch. I left in March." She looked at him steadily. "I heard you might have the little girl." Caleb's hand was on the gate. He didn't open it yet. "Who told you that?" "Millbridge isn't a big town," she said. "Dr. Shaw is known. People talk." She held his gaze. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here because—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. "Because Lily wasn't the first." The cold didn't feel like the cold anymore exactly. It felt like the air before a storm when everything goes still and wrong. He opened the gate. Clara Whitlock sat at Caleb's kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup and told her story the way people tell stories they've been carrying for a long time. In pieces, not in order, circling back to the parts that hurt before she could get past them. He let her do it that way. He'd learned long ago that a witness who tells things in the wrong order is usually more reliable than one who's rehearsed it into a straight line. She'd worked for Voss for 2 years, she said. Before that, she'd been a cook in Millbridge. And when the work dried up, she'd taken the position at the Voss Ranch because it paid better than anything else available, and she had a sister in Dillon she wanted to be near. She'd cooked and managed the household staff. There had been 4 of them at various times. Herself, a housekeeper, 2 men who worked the domestic side of the operation. They turned over constantly. Voss went through employees the way other men went through boot leather. "There was a boy," she said, "before Lily. Maybe 2 years before. His name was Henry. He was about 6 when I arrived, maybe 7. Small for his age." She looked at her coffee. "He was gone by the time I'd been there 3 months. Voss said he'd been sent to a school in the East, an educational institution. That's exactly how he said it. Educational institution, like he was reading it off a page. She was quiet for a moment. Nobody asked questions. He was Harlan Voss. You didn't ask. But you wondered, Caleb said. I wondered, she said. And then Lily came, and I wondered again. And by then I'd been there long enough to start understanding what I was looking at. Her hands tightened around the cup. He had papers on both of them. Said they came from a placement office out of Cheyenne, an outfit that placed orphaned children with suitable households. He had the documents. They looked official. You saw them? Once. He left them on the desk in his study when I came in to clean. I saw enough. She looked at him. The organization's name was the Calhoun County Welfare and Placement Society. I remembered it because it had county in the name, and I thought that meant it was official, government-run. She paused. It isn't, is it? I don't know yet, Caleb said. He wrote the name down. But I'm going to find out. There's more, she said. She looked at the table. The reason I left in March. I didn't leave because I wanted to. Voss told me I was being let go. He said my work wasn't satisfactory. The side of her mouth pulled slightly. I had been keeping records. Caleb looked up from his notebook. Not a formal record, just notes. Things I observed, dates, what I saw in the children, what was said, what happened when visitors came to the house. She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded envelope, set it on the table. I hid these before he could find them. He found the notebook eventually. That's why I was let go. But he didn't find these. Caleb opened the envelope carefully. Inside were 8 or 9 folded sheets of paper, dense with handwriting in a cramped and careful hand. He read the first page without speaking, then the second. Clara, he said, are you willing to sign a sworn statement? Everything you've told me today and everything in these notes? She looked at him. Her face was afraid and something stronger than afraid, in equal measure. Will it actually do something, or will it disappear like everything else disappears around Harlan Voss? It won't disappear, he said. I'm going to make sure of that. How? He looked at her directly. By making enough copies that disappearing one of them doesn't help. He leaned forward. I need you to understand that if you do this, he's going to know. He may already know you came here. She pulled her coat a little tighter. I know that, she said. I've known it since I drove through the gate. She looked past him, toward the hallway, as if she could see through the walls to wherever Lily was. She was such a quiet little thing, she said softly. She tried so hard not to take up any space, like she thought if she got small enough, nothing could find her. Her voice was steady, but only barely. No child should have to learn that. No, Caleb said. They shouldn't. She looked back at him. Get him, she said. It wasn't a request. It wasn't even quite a statement. It was the sound of something decided a long time ago finally being said out loud. That's what I'm doing, he said. After she left, with a promise to return in 2 days to give a formal statement, and a piece of paper with Caleb's name and Evelyn Shaw's name written on it, and instructions to tell someone she trusted where she was going and when she'd be back. Caleb stood at the window and watched her wagon go down the road, and he felt the thing he used to feel at the beginning of a real case, the thing he hadn't felt in 4 years. It wasn't excitement, exactly. It was more like the moment when a room comes into focus, when what was blurry and uncertain starts to take shape, and you begin to understand what you're actually dealing with. What he was dealing with was worse than he'd thought yesterday. The Calhoun County Welfare and Placement Society. He wrote the name again and looked at it. A private placement organization operating under a name that suggested official county authority. Children placed in households with documents that looked official. A boy named Henry who had disappeared before Lily arrived. A pattern that went back at least 2 years and probably further. Voss wasn't just abusing a child he'd taken in informally. He was using a system, a mechanism, something structured enough to produce paperwork and credible enough to satisfy anyone who looked at it from the outside. That was a different level of thing entirely. That was not a man who had slipped into cruelty gradually. That was a man who had built infrastructure around it. Caleb stood at the window for a long time. Then he went to the desk and added 3 more pages to his notes. And when he finally stopped, it was because Lily appeared in the doorway again and said, without preamble, "Are you going to eat dinner?" He realized it was past dark. He hadn't noticed. "Yes," he said. "Marcus made something," she said. "He says it's soup, but it looks like everything in the kitchen put into water." Caleb almost smiled. It was the closest he'd come to it in recent memory. "That's generally what soup is," he said. "Oh," she said. She seemed to file that away too. She looked at his desk, at the pages spread across it, and then at him. "Did someone come today? I heard voices." "A woman who used to work at the ranch where you lived," he said. "She's willing to help." Lily's expression shifted through something he couldn't name. "She's not scared of him?" "She is scared of him," Caleb said. "She came anyway." Lily was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Alderman was scared too," she said. "She told me once when she was tucking me in. She said she was sorry she couldn't do more. I didn't know what she meant then." "What do you think she meant now?" "That she wanted to help, but she didn't know how," Lily said. She said it matter-of-factly, the way children say true things that adults have spent years learning to say carefully. "I think sometimes people want to help, but they don't have anyone to help them help." Caleb looked at her. "That's exactly right," he said. She held the door frame. "Do you have people to help you help?" He thought about Marcus, and Evelyn Shaw riding 40 minutes in the cold, and Clara Whitlock at the gate with her envelope of hidden notes and her hands tight around a coffee cup. "I'm starting to," he said. She nodded. Then she said, "The soup is getting cold," and turned and went back down the hall, and he got up and followed her because you do. They ate around the table, him and Marcus and Lily, which was an arrangement that would have seemed impossible 4 days ago, and which now felt like the only arrangement that made sense. Marcus talked some, about a horse with a stiff knee and a fence line that needed work, the ordinary business of a ranch that kept going regardless of what else was happening. Lily ate steadily and didn't talk much, but she tracked the conversation, and once she asked Marcus what the horse's name was, and Marcus said Biscuit without hesitation, and she said, "That's a strange name for a horse," and Marcus said, "He came with it, and I didn't have the heart to change it," and something in the room shifted 3 degrees toward something warmer. After dinner, while Marcus cleaned up, Caleb sat at the table and Lily sat across from him, and he had a thought and acted on it before he had time to second-guess it. "Can you write anything?" he asked her. She shook her head. "No one taught me." "Would you like to learn?" She looked at him with the careful eyes. "Why?" He considered the question. "Because knowing how to write things down is useful," he said. "Because Mrs. Alderman was right about that. And because I think you're someone who notices things." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "What would I write?" "Anything you want," he said. "Your name first, then anything else." He tore a page from the back of his notebook and found a pencil that wasn't too worn and set them in front of her. He wrote Lily in large, clear letters at the top of the page and tapped each letter and said its name. She watched. Then she picked up the pencil. Her first letter was crooked. The second was worse. But she kept at it with a concentrated quiet that reminded him of the way she'd walked inside the night she'd arrived. Deliberate, careful, like someone who has decided to do a thing and is going to do it regardless of what else is happening around them. By the time Marcus had finished cleaning up, she had managed something that was recognizably an L and an I, if not the rest of it. She studied what she'd made. "It's not right," she said. "First time's not supposed to be right," Caleb said. "That's what second times are for." She looked at him, and for just a moment the careful eyes went somewhere else, somewhere younger, somewhere that 4 years old was supposed to look all the time. Then she looked back at the paper and picked up the pencil again. Caleb sat with her and said nothing and let the fire do its work against the cold outside. And somewhere to the north of them, 12 miles and a whole world away, Harlan Voss was sitting in his study with whatever he felt when things didn't go the way he'd arranged them to go. And he was making plans. But plans, Caleb had learned in 16 years of working against men like him, were only as good as the ground they were built on. And Caleb was very carefully, very methodically, examining the ground. Clara Whitlock came back 2 days later, as promised, and she brought someone with her. The second woman was younger. Mid-40s, thin, with the specific kind of stillness that belongs to people who have learned to take up very little space in a room. She introduced herself as Nora Greer. She had worked at the Voss Ranch for 8 months the previous year, handling laundry and household mending, and she had left, she said, because her mother in Millbridge had taken ill and needed her. She said it carefully, the way people say things that are true, but not the whole truth. Caleb let it go for the moment. He made coffee and sat them both down at the kitchen table and let Clara do the introducing and the explaining, because Clara had already decided to trust him and Nora was still working on it. Marcus took Lily out to see Biscuit, which had become a daily arrangement that Lily accepted with the particular dignity of a child pretending not to care about something she cared about very much. "Nora," Caleb said when the coffee was poured, "Clara tells me you were at the ranch." Nora looked at her cup. 8 months. "And you left because of your mother." A pause. "Yes." He didn't push on it. "Did you ever see a boy there?" "Before Lily." "Named Henry." Her head came up, just slightly, but he caught it. "Where did you hear that name?" "From Clara." Nora looked at Clara, who nodded once. Then she looked back at Caleb, and something shifted. The careful version of herself making room for the version that had been waiting to talk. "Henry was there when I arrived," she said. 7 years old. He was—" She stopped, steadied. "He was not a healthy child. Not in the way a child is unhealthy from bad food or cold weather, the other kind." "What happened to him?" In February, Mr. Voss announced that Henry was being transferred to an educational institution in Cheyenne. That's what he said. Transferred. Like the boy was a piece of equipment. She pressed her fingers together on the table. 2 men came with a wagon. Henry didn't want to go. He made noise, which he almost never did, and one of the men put a hand on his shoulder and he just went quiet, the way an animal goes quiet when it knows. She stopped again. "I never heard anything about him after that." Caleb wrote the date, February, last year, and the word transferred with a question mark after it. "Nora, do you know anything about the organization Voss used to get these children? The Calhoun County Welfare and Placement Society?" She frowned. "I heard that name once, one of the other men, Gary Tibbs. He handled horses. He mentioned it when he was talking to himself in the stable. I wasn't supposed to hear. He said something like Voss and his society friends. I didn't ask." "Is Gary Tibbs still working for Voss?" "I don't know. He was there when I left." Caleb nodded and wrote the name down. Then he looked at both women. "I'm going to be straight with you about what I'm building here and what I need from you. I have medical documentation from Dr. Shaw in Millbridge, formal record of Lily's injuries with professional assessment. I have Clara's notes from her time at the ranch. What I don't yet have is a chain that connects Voss to the organization he used to obtain these children, and I don't have anyone who can speak to the pattern, the fact that Lily is not an isolated case." He looked from one to the other. "You too can speak to the pattern." Nora was quiet for a moment. "If we give statements—" "He'll know," Claire said flatly. "He'll find out. He always finds out." "Yes," Caleb said. He didn't soften it. "He'll find out. And I won't pretend that doesn't carry risk, because it does. But I'm going to tell you something I know from 16 years of doing this work. Men like Voss stay powerful as long as they stay the only one who knows the full picture. The moment the picture becomes visible to enough people, enough different people in enough different places, the power stops working." He set his pen down. "I'm building copies. Multiple copies of everything, held in multiple places. I'm working with a doctor in Millbridge. I'm going to contact the federal circuit court in Cheyenne because Voss's influence ends at the county line. The point is to make the evidence so distributed that no single act of intimidation can erase it." Nora looked at him for a long time. "You sound like you've done this before." "I have," he said. "I haven't always won. But I know what makes the difference between the times I did and the times I didn't." "What makes the difference?" "Whether people held," he said simply. Clara looked at Nora. Something passed between them that was mostly face and not at all words. Then Clara turned back to Caleb and said, "What do we need to do?" He spent 2 hours taking their statements in full. Everything they'd observed, everything they'd heard, every date and name and detail they could recover from memory. Clara's notes filled in gaps that Nora's memory supplied the shape of, and Nora's observations from the stable and the laundry room filled in things Clara had never had access to from the kitchen. Together they produced 18 pages of handwritten testimony that Caleb read back to them sentence by sentence, correcting the places where he'd misheard and adding the places where one of them remembered something the reading had jogged loose. When they were done, both women signed each page. Caleb signed as witness. He made 2 copies by hand. It took an hour, and his writing hand was cramped by the end of it, and gave each woman 1 set to keep in a place known only to themselves. "If anyone comes asking questions," he said, "or if anything makes you feel unsafe, I want you to get to Evelyn Shaw in Millbridge. She knows what's happening. She'll know how to reach me." After they left, Caleb sat with the stack of papers in front of him and felt the weight of what he had and what he still needed. It was a significant body of evidence for a civil proceeding. For a criminal one, it was thinner. 2 former employees, 1 medical record, 1 set of hidden personal notes. Compelling. Not conclusive, not yet. Not in a court that Voss had spent years making comfortable for himself. He needed the placement society. He was still working out how to pursue that when Marcus came in from the cold with snow on his shoulders and Lily trailing behind him, both of them carrying the slightly windswept look of people who had been outside longer than planned. "She wanted to ride Biscuit," Marcus said as explanation. "Did she?" Caleb looked at Lily. "He didn't mind," Lily said with the authority of someone who had checked. "He stood very still." "He stands still for anyone who brings him a piece of apple," Marcus said. "That horse is not noble. He's just interested in apples." The smallest version of a smile crossed Lily's face and went away quickly, but it had been there and Caleb had seen it, and he wrote nothing down about it because some things you don't make a record of, you just carry. He was at his desk before sunrise the next morning, drafting a letter to the Federal Circuit Court in Cheyenne. He knew the clerk there, a man named George Aldis, who had processed more of Caleb's marshal paperwork than either of them had wanted to count, and who was, more importantly, the kind of bureaucrat who took irregularities seriously because the paperwork was supposed to be right, and he took it personally when it wasn't. Caleb wrote carefully, laying out the existence of the Calhoun County Welfare and Placement Society, the documents it had produced for Voss, and a formal request for investigation into whether those documents had been filed with any recognized authority, state or federal. He sealed it and gave it to Marcus with instructions to post it from Millbridge, not from Dillon. That afternoon, the trouble came. Not Parker this time, not Riders. A letter delivered by a boy Caleb didn't recognize, a teenager who handed it over at the gate without making eye contact and turned his horse around before Caleb had broken the seal. The envelope had no return address. Inside, on heavy cream paper that probably cost more than most men in the county made in a week, in handwriting that was very controlled and very clear. "Mr. Hargrove, I believe there has been a misunderstanding regarding my ward who I understand you may have encountered. I am prepared to discuss the matter as gentlemen, and I invite you to meet with me at the Continental Hotel in Dillon on Friday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, at which time I expect we can resolve this without further inconvenience to either party. H. Voss." Caleb read it twice. Then he set it on his desk. Marcus appeared in the doorway. "What is it?" "An invitation," Caleb said. Marcus read it and set it down. "Don't go," he said. "I have to go." "Caleb, if I don't go, he escalates. He's already established I won't be moved by a sheriff visit. The letter is him taking stock of what he's dealing with." Caleb picked it up again and looked at it. "He wants to look at me. He wants to figure out what I want." "And what are you going to tell him?" "The truth," Caleb said, carefully enough that he can't use it against me. Marcus folded his arms. "I don't like it." "I know. He's going to have people there." "In a hotel dining room in the middle of Dillon in the afternoon," Caleb said. "There are limits to what even Harlan Voss can do." He paused. "I'm going to need you to stay here with Lily." Marcus looked at him with the face that gave everything away. "Of course," he said. "But come back." "I intend to," Caleb said. He told Lily that evening because he'd decided early on that lying to her was not something he was going to do. He told her simply that he had a meeting in town with the man she'd come from and that he'd be back by evening and that Marcus would be here the whole time. She went very still when he said who the meeting was with. The kind of still that wasn't calm. "Don't make him angry," she said. Her voice was flat in the way it got when she was suppressing something. When he gets angry, things happen that can't be undone. "I know," Caleb said. "I'm not going to make him angry. I'm going to listen." "He'll try to make a deal," she said. Caleb looked at her. "What kind of deals did he make with other people?" She thought about it. "Money, mostly. He told Gary Tibbs once that he could make a problem disappear if Gary made a different problem disappear. Gary did it." She looked at the floor. "I don't know what Gary's problem was, but he stayed after that and he stopped talking to me when he saw me in the yard." Caleb added Gary Tibbs to his notes with 2 new details beside the name. Then he looked at Lily. "I'm not interested in his money," he said, "and I don't have problems he can make disappear." She looked at him with an expression that was almost the full weight of what she knew about men who said things like that. "Everybody has something," she said. He thought about Thomas. He thought about the particular shape of the last 4 years and what they'd cost him. He thought about the fact that he was sitting here at all, in this county, on this land, having walked away from everything else because everything else had become unbearable. "Maybe," he said, "but the things I've lost aren't things he can give back." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay," and went back to her letters, which she practiced every evening now on the back pages of Caleb's spare notebook, working through each one with the same methodical quiet she brought to everything. Friday was clear and brutally cold, the sky the particular pale blue that means no clouds and no warmth. Caleb rode into Dillon and left his horse at the livery at the edge of town and walked the main street to the Continental Hotel, which was the best building in Dillon and knew it, with its painted front and the brass fixtures on the door that somebody polished regularly. The dining room was half full. He had arrived 10 minutes early, which was intentional, and he took a table in the corner with his back to the wall, which was also intentional, and he ordered coffee from the woman who came to the table and sat and waited. Harlan Voss arrived at 2 o'clock exactly. He was not what Caleb had pictured, which was its own kind of information. He was not physically imposing. Medium height, well-fed but not fat, somewhere in his late 50s, with white hair and a carefully trimmed beard, and the kind of clothing that announces money without screaming it. He walked across the dining room like a man who was aware of every eye in the room and comfortable with all of them, and he sat down across from Caleb and looked at him with light gray eyes that were doing the same kind of reading Caleb's eyes were doing. "Mr. Hargrove," he said, "thank you for coming." "Mr. Voss," Caleb said. Voss ordered coffee from the woman without looking at her and set his hands flat on the table. "I'm going to speak plainly," he said. "I respect a man who does the same." "Go ahead," Caleb said. "The child was placed in my care through a legal process," Voss said. "The arrangement may not be formal by every standard you might apply, but it is functional and it has been working. She is fed, housed, and cared for." He paused. "Whatever she may have told you, I would encourage you to consider that a 4-year-old child is not always the most reliable source of information about her circumstances." Caleb said nothing. He looked at Voss's hands flat on the table, steady. This was not a man in crisis. This was a man who had handled problems before and expected to handle this one. "You've gone to some trouble," Voss said. "The doctor in Millbridge, Clara Whitlock." He watched Caleb's face when he said the names, watching for the flinch that would tell him how much the surveillance had spooked him. Caleb gave him nothing. "I understand you're a former federal marshal. I respect that service. And I understand that what you think you're seeing may look alarming from outside." "From outside," Caleb said. "There's always context," Voss said. "Context that isn't available to someone who's only seen one side of a thing." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm prepared to be reasonable. The child can remain in your care temporarily while a proper legal process is completed. I'll speak to Wade Parker about dropping any inquiry for the time being, and I'm prepared," he paused just briefly, "to offer fair compensation for your time and trouble." Caleb let the offer sit on the table between them. He looked at Voss for a moment, then he said, "Tell me about Henry." The silence that followed was 3 seconds long, and in those 3 seconds, Caleb learned more about Harlan Voss than an hour of conversation would have told him. The hands on the table didn't move, the face didn't move, but something went through the gray eyes that was not the steady, comfortable thing that had been there before. "I don't know who you mean," Voss said. 7 years old, Caleb said. Transferred to an educational institution in Cheyenne, February of last year. 2 men with a wagon. He didn't want to go. "I've housed a number of children through the Placement Society over the years," Voss said carefully. "Charitable work. Each case is different." "A number of children," Caleb said. "I'm a generous man," Voss said, and he said it the way you state a fact about yourself that the world has already confirmed. Caleb looked at him. "Where's Henry now?" "I told you, an educational—" "I heard what you said," Caleb said. "I'm asking you where the boy actually is." Voss looked at him for a long moment. Then he sat back, and the thing in his eyes settled into something colder and less conversational. "I see," he said. "You're not here to negotiate." "No," Caleb said. "I came to look at you." He picked up his coffee cup. "I've been building a case for 11 days. I have medical records, sworn statements from 2 former employees, documentation of the Calhoun County Welfare and Placement Society's operating history, and a letter to the Federal Circuit Court in Cheyenne requesting investigation." He set the cup down. "I also have Lily, and Lily is staying where she is." The dining room had the usual sounds of a hotel dining room. Cutlery, low conversation, the kitchen beyond the door. None of it touched the table where they were sitting. "You're making a significant mistake," Voss said. His voice was very quiet now, quieter than before. "I've made mistakes before," Caleb said. "This isn't one of them." Voss looked at him with the gray eyes, and Caleb looked back, and neither man looked away for a long moment. Then Voss said, "You have people you care about. The ranch hand, the doctor in Millbridge." "I do," Caleb said, "and they know everything I know, which means threatening them accomplishes nothing except adding to the evidence file." He stood. He left money on the table for the coffee. "I'd recommend speaking to a lawyer, Mr. Voss. A good one. You're going to need one." He walked out of the Continental Hotel and into the cold afternoon and down the main street of Dillon, and he did not look back, because looking back was for men who weren't sure. He was back at the ranch by 5 o'clock. Marcus was in the barn. Lily was at the kitchen table practicing her letters and looked up when he came in, and the question in her face was so direct and so unguarded that for a moment it just sat there. "I'm back," he said. "Did he try to pay you?" she asked. "He offered." "What did you say?" "Nothing worth repeating," Caleb said. She nodded. She looked down at her page. Then she held it up. She'd written Lily in letters that were still crooked but unmistakably letters, all the way across the top of the page. "I did the whole name," she said. He looked at it. "You did," he said. "It took a long time." "Most things worth doing do," he said, and he meant it about more than the letters. And she seemed to understand that, and she looked at her page with an expression that was several things at once, and not entirely one of them. 2 days later, things got worse. The letter came from a solicitor's office in Dillon, a man named Arthur Price, who had, according to Marcus, handled Harlan Voss's legal affairs for the better part of a decade. The letter stated that Caleb Hargrove was in violation of a lawful guardianship arrangement and demanded the immediate return of the child known as Lily to the legal custody of Harlan Voss, citing an attached document purporting to be a formal custody agreement filed with the Calhoun County Recorder's Office 3 months prior. Caleb read the attached document twice. It was 3 pages, official-looking, with the county recorder's stamp on the front page, and Voss's signature and 2 witness signatures at the bottom. He turned it over and looked at the back, and then turned it over again. Then he said very quietly, to no one in particular, Marcus, reading over his shoulder, said, "That's new?" "It's 3 months old," Caleb said, "which means it was created before she ran," Marcus said. "Before she ran." Caleb set it down. "Or it was created after she ran and backdated." He ran his thumb across the recorder's stamp. "I need to find out whether this was actually filed with the county 3 months ago, or whether that stamp was applied last week." "How do you do that?" The county recorder keeps a log, Caleb said. Every document filed has a date and an entry number, and those entries are sequential. If this document was filed 3 months ago, its entry number should fall between the documents filed on either side of it. He tapped the stamp. If that entry number doesn't exist in the log, or if it corresponds to a different document, then this is a forgery. Marcus looked at him. How do you know things like that? I spent 2 years on a land fraud case in Colorado, Caleb said. I know more about forged county records than any reasonable person should. He needed access to the county recorder's office in Dillon, and he needed it without alerting Parker or anyone connected to Voss, which meant he couldn't walk in and identify himself. He sent a letter to Evelyn Shaw first, explaining what he'd found and what he needed. The next morning, she appeared at his gate with a look of focused anger that he was coming to recognize as her version of fully committed. I have a patient in Dillon on Thursday, she said. Mrs. Carroll, who is 72 and has been coming to me for 2 years and has no connection to Voss. I can go to the recorder's office afterward with a reasonable pretext. I'm researching property boundaries near Millbridge for a potential land purchase. It's not untrue. I've been meaning to look at it for a year. She looked at him. What exactly am I looking for? He explained the entry number system and what a discrepancy would look like. He wrote down the document reference numbers and gave her the sheet. If it's not there, what does that mean for your case? She asked. It means Voss or someone working for him forged a county record, Caleb said, which is a criminal offense, which means this stops being a civil custody matter and becomes something the state has to pay attention to regardless of who Harlan Voss is friends with. Evelyn looked at the sheet. Then she said, You know, when Marcus came and told me a ranch hand had had an accident, I thought it was going to be a broken finger. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it. Don't be, she said. I was bored. She folded the sheet and put it in her coat. I'll send word when I know. She sent word on Friday, a brief note delivered by the same route Marcus had used the first time, short enough to be entirely innocent to anyone who read it and didn't know what they were reading. Found the library you asked about. The book you described isn't in the catalog. We'll explain in person Saturday. Caleb read it standing at the kitchen window in the early morning and felt something settle in him. Not satisfaction, not yet, but the particular sensation of solid ground where previously there had been uncertainty. The entry number on Voss's custody document did not exist in the county recorder's log. The documents on either side of it were filed 4 months apart, which meant the number had been inserted into the sequence retrospectively and sloppily. Whoever had done it had not accounted for the sequential logic of entry numbers, or had assumed no one would check. Voss had forged a county record. He had forged it, which meant he knew the legitimate documentation he had was not sufficient, which meant the Placement Society's paperwork was either also fraudulent or thin enough that he hadn't trusted it to hold up under real scrutiny. And he had done it in a hurry, 3 months ago, after Lily had arrived, which suggested he had recognized the risk of her leaving even before she did. Caleb added this to the file, which was now thick enough that it took both hands to hold. He organized it into sections: medical evidence, testimonial evidence, documentary evidence. And he made a third copy, and he put that copy in the locked box under the floorboard in the back room that had not been opened in 4 years, and smelled like the past, but was dry and solid. That evening, Lily watched him seal the papers into their sections and said, "Is it enough?" He thought about lying to her the way adults lie to children when the truth is complicated. He decided against it. "Not yet," he said, "but we're close." "What's still missing?" "The system," he said. "The organization Voss used to get you and Henry. I need to prove it was fraudulent, not just informal. And I need to find someone who can stand in front of a judge and speak to the whole thing, not just one piece of it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There was a man who came to the house sometimes. Not often. 3 or 4 times in the time I was there. Mr. Voss was always different when he visited. Careful." She looked at her hands. "His name was Aldridge, or something like that. He wore a brown coat, and he smelled like cigars, and he always brought papers." Caleb put his pen down. "Papers." "A leather case," she said. "Flat. He and Mr. Voss would go into the study and close the door." She looked up. "Once I heard Mr. Voss say, 'The next placement, and the other man said something about a family in Laramie, and Mr. Voss said he wasn't interested in Laramie. She paused. I was in the hall. I wasn't supposed to be there. Of course not, Caleb said softly. He wrote Aldridge, brown coat, leather case, placement discussions, and looked at it. A man who brought papers and discussed future placements. Not county commission, not the sheriff's office. Someone who operated at the organizational level of the society itself. Someone who was not Voss but was connected to him at the source. Lily, he said carefully, did you ever see his full name? On the papers, or... She thought hard, the concentrating face again. There was a letter, she said. On the hall table once. I saw the name at the top. I couldn't read it, but I remember the shape. She picked up a pencil and drew on the edge of the page. Not letters exactly, but the shape of letters, the length and curve of a word. She drew it twice, then looked at it critically. Like that, I think. He looked at what she'd drawn. The first letter was clearly an A. The rest resolved itself with some interpretation into 6 or 7 characters. He stared at it for a long moment. Then he wrote, underneath her drawing, Aldridge. He didn't know if it was right, but he knew someone who might. He picked up his pen and started writing a second letter to George Aldis at the Federal Circuit Court in Cheyenne, this time with the name to search for alongside the society's operating records. Outside, the wind had picked up again, working at the corners of the house the way it always did, but inside the wood stove was doing its job, and the lamp was lit, and Lily was sitting across from him drawing the shapes of letters she was still learning, and the file on Harlan Voss was growing, page by page, into something that was beginning to look like what it needed to be. The reply from George Aldis arrived on a Tuesday, 9 days after Caleb had sent the second letter, and it was longer than he'd expected. Aldis wrote in the compressed, precise style of a man who had spent 30 years producing official correspondence and had forgotten how to write any other way. But the information inside the formal language was anything but dry. The Calhoun County Welfare and Placement Society had filed articles of incorporation with the Wyoming Territorial Government 4 years earlier, listing 3 founding members. The registered agent of the organization was a man named Edmund Aldridge, listed as operating from an address in Cheyenne. The society had no formal affiliation with any county or territorial government body, despite its name. Its stated purpose was the placement of orphaned and abandoned children with suitable households throughout Calhoun and surrounding counties. In 4 years of operation, it had filed paperwork on 11 children. 11. Caleb read that number twice. He set the letter down and picked it up and read it again. 11 children placed through an organization that had no government oversight, no independent board, no requirement to account for the welfare of the children after placement. 11 children, of whom he could currently account for 2, Lily, who was sitting 30 feet away practicing her alphabet, and Henry, who had been taken away in a wagon in February and had not been heard from since. He wrote 11 children, 4 years, Edmund Aldridge, Cheyenne at the top of a fresh page, and stared at it for a long moment. Aldis had included one more piece of information at the bottom of the letter, almost as an afterthought, in a slightly smaller hand than the rest. He had located a federal inquiry, opened 8 months prior in Laramie County, into the activities of a child placement organization operating without territorial licensing. The inquiry had been opened on the complaint of a woman whose name was redacted in the copy he had access to. It had been suspended after 2 months due to insufficient cooperating witnesses. The name of the organization in the Laramie inquiry was not identical to the Calhoun County Welfare and Placement Society, but the registered agent listed was the same man, Edmund Aldridge. Caleb folded the letter and put it in the file and went to find Marcus. He found him in the barn, which was where Marcus usually was when something needed thinking through. Not that he went there to think, necessarily, but the work of a barn had the quality of keeping hands busy while a mind ran its own course. Marcus was repairing a broken stall latch, and he looked up when Caleb came in and read his face immediately. "What now?" Marcus said. Caleb told him about Aldis's letter. He told him about the 11 children, about Edmund Aldridge, about the suspended inquiry in Laramie County. Marcus listened without interrupting, which was one of the things about Marcus that Caleb had come to rely on without fully acknowledging it. When Caleb finished, Marcus set down the latch. 11 children, he said, in 4 years. And nobody noticed. Somebody noticed, Caleb said. In Laramie County. Not enough somebodies. He looked at the stall wall. Which is the problem? A suspended federal inquiry means there's an open file somewhere in the territorial system. If I can get new witness testimony in front of the right person, that inquiry can be reopened. And a reopened federal inquiry is something Voss cannot handle with county resources. The woman who filed the original complaint, Marcus said. The one who's redacted. Exactly what I was thinking, Caleb said. How do you find a redacted name? Carefully, Caleb said. And through channels Voss isn't watching. He paused. I need to go to Cheyenne. Marcus looked at him. 2 days, Caleb said. Maybe 3. I need to sit in front of George Aldis in person, and I need to see the original complaint file, not a copy. I need to find out what happened to the witnesses who stopped cooperating. He met Marcus's eyes. I need you to stay with Lily. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Voss knows you've been building the case. He's not going to hold still while you're gone. I know. He might come to the property. He might. Which is why I'm going to talk to Evelyn Shaw before I leave, and I'm going to make sure Clara Whitlock knows I'm out of town, and I'm going to write out explicit instructions for what you do if Parker shows up with a warrant. He looked at Marcus directly. I'm also going to need you to take the locked box from under the floorboard and keep it somewhere he doesn't know about. Not the barn, somewhere off the property. Marcus thought about it. My sister's place, in Millbridge. She's got a root cellar nobody goes into in winter. Perfect. Marcus picked up the latch again and then put it back down. Caleb, what if the judge in Cheyenne tells you it's not enough? Caleb had been thinking about that since Tuesday. Then I go back and get more, he said. There isn't a version of this where I stop. Marcus nodded. It was the kind of nod that meant more than agreement. That evening, Caleb told Lily he was going to be away for a few days. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and said it plainly and watched her face do what it did. The immediate tightening, the internal calculation, the careful return to neutral. How many days? She asked. 2 or 3, he said. I'll be back before the end of the week. Marcus will be here? The whole time. And Dr. Shaw knows I'm going and she'll check in. He paused. Lily, I need you to tell me if you're scared. She considered the question the way she considered most things. Seriously, and without pretending it was simpler than it was. I'm always a little scared, she said. I got used to it. You shouldn't have to be used to it. I know, she said. But I am. She looked at her hands. When you come back, will there be more to do or will it be closer to finished? Closer to finished, he said. Significantly closer. She looked at him for a long moment with those old, careful eyes. Then she nodded. Okay, she said. Go. He rode to Millbridge early the next morning, before Lily was awake, and caught the stage to Cheyenne, which was a 12-hour journey in a coach that needed new springs and had a draft through the left window that no amount of adjusting the curtain fully corrected. He spent the journey reading through the documents he'd brought with him and thinking about gaps, and by the time the coach pulled into Cheyenne in the early evening, he had a clearer picture of what he had and what he still needed than he'd had when he left. George Aldis met him at the circuit court office the following morning. He was a narrow man in his 60s with a dry handshake and spectacles that he kept adjusting and the expression of someone who has seen a great deal of paperwork and is cautiously willing to be interested in more. He led Caleb to a back office with boxes along one wall and 2 chairs and a table and shut the door. I pulled the Laramie file, Aldis said, setting a folder on the table. After I sent you the letter, I had a feeling you'd come in person. Caleb opened the folder. The original complaint was 12 pages, handwritten, and the name at the top had been blacked out with heavy ink, but imperfectly. In the lower right corner of the second page, where the writer had signed her initial notation, the ink was thinner, and when Caleb held the page at an angle to the light coming through the window, he could read 2 letters through it. R.A. Ruth Alderman. He set the page down slowly. The woman who filed this complaint, he said, she had worked in a household in Calhoun County as a housekeeper. She was dismissed in September, 2 months before she filed the complaint. He looked at Aldis, and then the inquiry was suspended. 2 witnesses agreed to speak, Aldis said, his voice carefully neutral. Then within 3 weeks, both declined to continue. The woman who filed the complaint became unreachable. The address she'd given for correspondence stopped producing responses. She went somewhere she thought she'd be safe, Caleb said. He was thinking about the son in Colorado, Danny, a son named Danny, and nobody looked for her. The inquiry was suspended for insufficient cooperation, Aldous said. He said it the way a man says something he has not felt comfortable about for 8 months. I should tell you, Mr. Hargrove, that when your letter arrived, both of them, I showed them to Judge Reginald Holt. He is the senior circuit court judge for this territory, and he is not a man with connections to Calhoun County or to anyone named Voss. Caleb looked up. What did he say? He said to tell you that if you can produce cooperating witnesses to the activities described in this file, he will open a formal territorial inquiry himself. Not a county proceeding, a territorial one. Aldous adjusted his spectacles. That means Calhoun County's legal infrastructure, including Sheriff Parker's office, has no authority to interfere. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Something moved through him that was not quite relief and not quite satisfaction, but was in the neighborhood of both. Can I meet him? He's expecting you at 11, Aldous said. Judge Reginald Holt was 70 years old and looked like someone had assembled him from the spare parts of several more intimidating men. Large hands, a wide forehead, white eyebrows that moved independently of each other to express things his voice didn't bother with. He shook Caleb's hand once and gestured to the chair across his desk and read through the documents Caleb laid out in front of him without speaking for 22 minutes. Caleb counted, because there was nothing else to do and the clock on the wall was loud. When Holt looked up, his expression was composed and very focused. Former federal marshal, he said. 16 years, Caleb said. Then you understand what I'm looking at. I believe so. You have medical evidence, testimonial evidence from 2 former employees, and documentation of a forged county record. Holt tapped the papers. You have a second-hand reference to a man named Aldridge, who connects the local case to a broader pattern, and you have a child whose account, while credible, cannot be the cornerstone of a legal proceeding. He looked at Caleb steadily. What you do not yet have is a living, cooperating witness who can speak to the society's operations from a position of direct knowledge. The 2 former employees can speak to what happened inside Voss's household. That's Voss's personal conduct. To prosecute the organization itself, I need someone who knows how it worked from inside the mechanism. Ruth Alderman, Caleb said. She filed the original Laramie complaint. I believe she's in Colorado. I believe her son lives there, and that's where she went when she became unreachable. Holt was quiet for a moment. If you can find her and bring her testimony, and if she is willing to speak at a formal proceeding, I will open the territorial inquiry, and I will personally ensure that the Calhoun County proceedings are moved to a neutral jurisdiction. He paused. Can you do that? I can try, Caleb said. It was the honest answer. Holt nodded. Mr. Hargrove, I've been on this bench for 19 years. I've seen what men like Voss build, and I've seen what it takes to dismantle it. He looked at the file again. You've built something solid here. Don't lose it because you moved too fast at the end. I won't, Caleb said. He left Cheyenne the next morning and was back at the ranch by nightfall on Thursday. The lamp was lit in the kitchen window when he came up the road, which was something he had not had to look forward to in a long time, and which hit him somewhere he hadn't expected. Marcus met him at the barn door. Quiet while you were gone, he said, which meant not entirely quiet, but nothing that had required force. Parker rode by twice, didn't stop. He's watching, Caleb said. Something else, Marcus said. He paused. A man came by yesterday afternoon, said his name was Gary Tibbs. Caleb went still. The name from the notes. The man Nora Greer had mentioned. The horse handler who had made a deal with Voss, who had gone quiet after whatever problem Voss had made disappear. What did he want? He wouldn't say to me, Marcus said. He said he wanted to talk to you. He left an address in town and said he'd be there through Sunday. Marcus looked at him carefully. He didn't look good, Caleb. The kind of not good that comes from not sleeping. Caleb unsaddled his horse in silence and put him up and went inside. Lily was asleep. He stood in the doorway of her room for a moment and then went to the kitchen and made himself something to eat and sat at the table and thought. Gary Tibbs. A man who had taken Voss's help and stayed quiet after. A man who had been there when Henry was taken away. A man who was now not sleeping and had come looking for Caleb Hargrove. Something had changed for Gary Tibbs. People didn't seek out the people building cases against their employers unless something had changed. He went into town the next morning. The address Marcus had written down was a rooming house on the east side of Dillon, a 3-story wooden building that had seen better decades. Caleb found the room number and knocked and waited, and the door opened to reveal a man in his 40s who looked like he hadn't slept in considerably longer than a few days. He was thick-set, rough-handed, with a beard that had grown past intent into neglect, and he looked at Caleb with the eyes of a man who has made a decision he's not sure about and is still not sure about it. "Hargrove," he said. "Tibbs," Caleb said. "You wanted to talk." Tibbs stepped back from the door. The room was small and smelled like tobacco and unwashed clothing and the particular staleness of a space where a person has been spending too much time alone. There was one chair. Tibbs sat on the edge of the bed, and Caleb took the chair and waited. "I heard you're building something against Voss," Tibbs said. "Word gets around. In this county it does." Tibbs looked at his hands. "I worked for him 4 years. You probably know that already." "I know some of it," Caleb said. "I know you made a deal with him. I know you stayed quiet after." Tibbs' jaw tightened. "The deal was he made a debt go away. I owed money to a man who was not the kind of man you owe money to. Voss paid it. And in exchange," he stopped. "In exchange, I kept my mouth shut about what I saw." "What did you see?" Tibbs was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Caleb started to think he was going to close up again, pull back from whatever edge he'd come to the edge of. Then he said, "I was there when the Aldridge man came. More than once. I handled the horses when he came and went, and one time he left a satchel in the stable by accident, and I looked inside it before I sent one of the boys to take it to the house." Caleb said nothing. He waited. "It was papers," Tibbs said. "Forms. Printed forms with blanks to fill in. They had the Placement Society's letterhead at the top. And there were names on some of them. Children's names and ages and descriptions." He swallowed. "Like you'd describe livestock, weight, height, general health. I didn't understand all of what I was reading, and I put it back before anyone knew I'd looked." He paused. "But I remembered." "How many names were on those forms?" Tibbs thought. 7 or 8 on the ones I saw. Maybe more that I didn't get to." He looked at Caleb. "Henry was one of them. I saw his name." The room was very quiet. Outside, something fell over in the street, a cartwheel or a barrel, and neither man reacted to it. "Tibbs," Caleb said, "I need you to understand what I'm going to ask you and what it means. I'm not going to tell you it's safe, because it isn't, not entirely. But I'm going to tell you what I know." He leaned forward. "I have a territorial circuit court judge in Cheyenne who is prepared to open a formal inquiry the moment I give him enough cooperating witnesses. A territorial inquiry means Voss's connections in this county are irrelevant. It means the debt that was paid on your behalf gets examined for what it was, which is an inducement to suppress evidence. And it means you have a choice right now between being part of the case against him and potentially being part of the case in a different sense." Tibbs stared at him. "You're saying if I don't talk, I could be charged." "I'm saying a territorial inquiry is going to find what it finds," Caleb said carefully. "And the people who came forward before it started are going to be in a different position than the people who didn't." It was not quite a threat. It was not quite not a threat. It was the truth. And Caleb delivered it as such, and he watched Tibbs sit with it. "What would I have to do?" Tibbs said finally. "Give a sworn statement. Everything you told me just now, and anything else you remember, written down and signed. Then, if it comes to a formal hearing, testify in person." Tibbs rubbed his face with both hands. "He'll know." "Yes. He knows where I am right now, probably." "Probably," Caleb said, "which means your silence is already less valuable to him than it was. He's watching to see if you'll talk." He paused. "The safest place for you to be is on the record, Tibbs. It's harder to silence someone who's already spoken." Tibbs sat with that for a long moment. Then he said, "The boy, Henry, you said you're looking for him." "I am." "When I saw his name on those forms, there was a notation beside it," Tibbs said slowly. A place name. I thought it was a destination, so where he was being sent. It wasn't Cheyenne. It was a town further east. Goshen, I think. Or near Goshen. He looked up. I don't know if that helps. It helps, Caleb said, and meant it. He wrote it down. Are you willing to give me a statement today? Tibbs looked at his hands again, at the floor, at the window, the process of a man deciding something he can't undecide and knowing it. Yeah, he said. Yeah, all right. Caleb spent 2 hours in that small room taking Gary Tibbs' statement in full, and when it was done and signed, he had a witness who had seen the Placement Society's operational paperwork firsthand and could describe its contents under oath. He had a possible location for Henry. He had, for the first time, something that touched the mechanism itself rather than only its effects. He rode back to the ranch with the signed statement inside his coat and his mind working the way it worked when a thing was moving toward its conclusion, quickly, in multiple directions, looking for what could still go wrong. What could go wrong was Voss moving first, and Voss moved the next morning. Caleb was at his desk before sunrise when he heard Marcus shout from the yard. Not a word, just his voice, raised in a way that meant something was wrong. He was at the door with his coat half on when he saw the smoke. Not the house. The barn. Not a large fire, not yet, but the southeast corner of the barn roof had caught, and the flames were moving in the direction the wind was carrying them, which was toward the main structure. Marcus was already at the pump, and Caleb ran to help him, and they worked the pump and the bucket line for the better part of an hour, in the dark and cold until the fire was out, and the southeast corner of the roof was a scorched ruin, but the barn itself was standing. Marcus stood in the yard afterward with black on his hands and his face, and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "It started from the outside." "I know," Caleb said. "There were boot tracks in the snow, 2 people, maybe 3. They came up from the south field." Caleb looked at the barn. Then he looked at the house. The lamp was on in Lily's window, which meant she was awake. He went inside. She was standing in the hallway in her nightgown with the wool blanket around her shoulders, and she looked at the black on his hands and his face, and she said very quietly, "He did that." "Probably," Caleb said. "He burns things when he's angry," she said. It was not a statement of surprise. It was the statement of someone reporting known information about a known phenomenon. "He burned Mrs. Alderman's book." "This is different," Caleb said. "Mrs. Alderman's book was a warning. This is panic." He looked at her. "Lily, men like Voss don't start burning things until they're scared, until they think they're losing." He held her gaze. "He's scared." She looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in her face. Not relief exactly, but the beginning of something that might eventually become relief. "Are you scared?" she asked. He thought about the barn. He thought about what a burning barn meant in practical terms. The horses were safe. Marcus had gotten them out. But the southeast corner was going to need significant work before spring, and the work was going to take time and money he hadn't planned to spend. He thought about what it meant that Voss had sent men to do it instead of coming himself, which meant Voss was still calculating, still trying to intimidate rather than escalate to something that would require him to explain himself to someone with more authority than Wade Parker. "No," he said, and found, checking it, that it was true. He was angry. He was very, very angry. But anger and fear were different animals, and right now only one of them was sitting in his chest. "Okay," she said. He got her back to bed and sat with her for a few minutes until her breathing steadied, and then he went back to his desk and wrote 3 letters. One to Judge Holt in Cheyenne, documenting the fire and its probable cause, and requesting that the timeline on the inquiry be accelerated. One to Evelyn Shaw, telling her to increase her check-ins and to keep the file copies she held in a location away from her office. One to Clara Whitlock and Nora Greer together, warning them that Voss was escalating and asking them to be careful about their movements, and to tell someone trustworthy where they were going whenever they left their homes. He sealed all 3 and gave them to Marcus at first light, with instructions to ride to Millbridge and post them before anything else. Marcus took them. He paused at the gate. "The barn's going to need a week's work, at minimum." "I know." "You can't do that and run the case at the same time." "I know that too," Caleb said. "Which is why you're going to start on the barn and I'm going to finish the case. Marcus looked at him with the face that gave everything away. You know what you're doing? Most of it, Caleb said. That was on a Wednesday. By Friday, things had changed again. Parker came to the ranch in the afternoon, Sharautst. Not with riders this time, not with the posture of official business. He came alone, and he tied his horse at the gate and walked up to the porch and knocked, which was something he hadn't done the first time. Caleb opened the door and looked at him. Parker looked different. Older, maybe, or just more tired. He held his hat in both hands, which was not the posture of a man delivering ultimatums. I need to talk to you, Parker said, not as the sheriff. Caleb looked at him for a moment. Then he stepped back from the door. Parker came in and stood in the kitchen and looked at the room with an expression Caleb couldn't immediately read. He didn't sit down, which seemed like a decision rather than an oversight. I know about the fire, Parker said. I also know I can't prove who set it, and I'm not going to pretend I'd have pushed very hard to prove it 2 weeks ago. He paused. That's changed. What changed it? Caleb said. Parker was quiet for a long moment. He turned his hat in his hands. I've been sheriff of this county for 12 years, he said. I know what I've allowed to happen. I know the shape of it. He looked at Caleb directly. Harlan Voss has, over those 12 years, done me favors, helped with my election, made certain complications go away. In exchange, I have looked where he told me to look, and not looked where he told me not to. He stopped. I told myself that most of what he did wasn't my business, that a man's private affairs on his own property weren't a matter for the sheriff's office unless someone filed a complaint. Nobody filed a complaint, Caleb said, because they were afraid of what would happen if they did. I know that, Parker said. His voice was flat. I've known it for a while. I just chose to know it quietly. He looked at the floor. I had a daughter once. She'd be about 8 now. He stopped there and didn't continue that sentence, and Caleb didn't push on it. When I saw that little girl's name in the paperwork Voss sent over, what she looked like in the description, how old she was, he stopped again. I'm not here to make myself feel better. I just want to know what you need. Caleb looked at him for a long time. He thought about 16 years of working with compromised men, bought men who had decided that the small surrenders were survivable until the day they discovered they weren't. He thought about what use Parker was, and what risk Parker was, and how those two things had to be weighed. I need you to write down everything you know, Caleb said. Every instruction Voss gave you, every time you acted on it, every piece of paperwork you processed that you knew was irregular. Everything, signed and dated. Parker's jaw tightened. That'll end my career. Probably, Caleb said. He didn't soften it. Parker stood with that for a moment. Then he said, Is it enough? What you've got, with mine added to it. Caleb thought about Judge Holt. He thought about the file, now more than 40 pages, covering medical evidence and forged county records and placement society paperwork, and Gary Tibbs's account of the livestock-style forms, and Ruth Alderman's original complaint, and Clara Whitlock's hidden notes, and Nora Greer's testimony, and everything else. He thought about Edmund Aldridge in Cheyenne, and a town called Goshen, and a boy named Henry who might still be findable. With yours added to it, he said, yes, it's enough to open the territorial inquiry, and from there, it goes where the evidence takes it. Parker nodded once. Then let's do it, he said, before I change my mind. They sat at Caleb's kitchen table until dark, Parker talking and Caleb writing, and when it was done, the statement was 11 pages, and Parker's hand shook slightly when he signed each one. Caleb didn't comment on the shaking, some things you don't have to name to understand. After Parker left, Caleb sat alone at the table in the quiet house and looked at what he had. He thought about what Holt had said. Don't lose it because you move too fast at the end. He thought about the fire in the barn and what it meant about Voss's state of mind. And he thought about a man who built his power on fear, discovering that fear was running out of things to hold on to. He thought about Lily, asleep at the end of the hall, who had walked 8 miles in the December snow barefoot because she had decided that the risk of leaving was smaller than the certainty of staying, and who had turned out to be right. He picked up his pen and wrote the summary he would send to Judge Holt. Not a letter this time, but a formal summary of the complete evidence file, organized by category, with page references and a list of available witnesses and a clear statement of what the testimony established. He wrote it the way he'd written federal case summaries for 16 years, in the plain, precise language that left no room for misreading, and when he was done it was past midnight and his hand ached and the fire had burned down to coals. He put the pen down. He looked at the stack of pages. 47 pages of evidence, 7 named witnesses, 1 forged county document, 1 suspended territorial inquiry about to be unsuspended, and 1 man in Cheyenne named Edmund Aldridge, who did not yet know that his name was on a page in a stack of pages on a kitchen table in Calhoun County. Outside, the wind had dropped for the first time in days. The yard was quiet. The barn stood, scorched but standing, which was its own kind of statement about what you can survive if you don't let it finish you. Caleb banked the coals and blew out the lamp and went to bed, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, he slept before 3 in the morning. The summary reached Judge Holt on a Thursday. His response arrived the following Monday, and it was not a letter this time, but an official document, a territorial inquiry order, signed and sealed, with Holt's full authority behind it and the name of a federal marshal assigned to execute it. The marshal's name was Daniel Creed. He arrived in Calhoun County on Wednesday morning with 2 deputies and a letter from the territorial governor's office that made it unambiguously clear that no county official had the authority to obstruct, redirect, or delay what was about to happen. Parker, to his credit, did not try. He met Creed at the county line and rode with him into Dillon and showed him where Voss's solicitor had his office and where the county recorder's files were kept, and then stepped back and let the federal machinery do what it was designed to do. Caleb was not there for any of that. He heard about it from Marcus, who had ridden into Dillon and watched from a distance with the careful attention of a man who has been involved in something long enough to want to see how it unfolds. What Marcus described was not dramatic in the way the previous weeks had been dramatic. It was methodical. Creed and his deputies moved through Dillon like people who had done this kind of thing before and were not interested in theater. They seized records. They served papers. They posted notices at the county recorder's office and the courthouse and the front door of Voss's solicitor's office, informing anyone who needed to know that the Calhoun County Welfare and Placement Society was under federal investigation and that all records pertaining to its activities were now under court seal. Edmund Aldridge was arrested in Cheyenne the same day, before noon, at the office address he'd listed on the Society's Articles of Incorporation. George Aldis wrote to Caleb about it later. A brief note, dry as everything Aldis wrote, mentioning that Aldridge had been in the middle of preparing documents for what appeared to be 2 additional placements when federal officers arrived, which meant the machinery had been running all along, right up to the moment it was stopped. 2 additional children, names Caleb never learned and families he couldn't identify from situations he could only approximate. He thought about them sometimes, some not with the helpless grief he might have felt a year earlier, but with the particular anger of a man who understands exactly how close things came to being different. Harlan Voss was served at his ranch on Wednesday afternoon. Caleb was at his own ranch when it happened and did not witness it, which was probably for the best. What he knew was what Marcus reported, and what Evelyn Shaw confirmed from a source in Dillon, that Voss had come to the door himself when the federal deputies knocked, and that he had stood on his porch with the cold air coming down off the mountain and looked at the papers being handed to him, and that the expression on his face had been the expression of a man encountering something he had genuinely believed would never arrive. Not panic, not rage, something worse than both. The specific, devastating look of a man whose picture of himself and of the world has just been revised without his permission, in a direction he can't reverse. He had said, according to the deputy who served him, there must be some mistake. He had said it twice. The deputy had said, no, sir, and that had been the end of that. The formal hearing was set for 3 weeks out, in Rawlins, in the court of Judge Reginald Holt, which was neutral ground, not Calhoun County, not Cheyenne, but a territorial courthouse that answered to no one Harlan Voss had ever bought dinner. Those 3 weeks were not easy. They were not easy because Voss's solicitor, Arthur Price, filed motions, 6 of them in the first 10 days, attempting to delay, reframe, and minimize. They were not easy because 2 of the witnesses Caleb had assembled received visitors in the night, not violent visitors, just men who knocked on doors and spoke quietly about the inadvisability of certain decisions. And both witnesses called the experience frightening enough that Caleb had to spend 2 days reassuring them that Creed's deputies were aware of the intimidation attempts and that each one was being added to the evidence file. They were not easy because the Dillon County Commissioner, a man named Federley, who owed Voss a significant amount of money in ways that were about to become public, published a letter in the county paper arguing that Harlan Voss was a pillar of the community who was being targeted by outside agitators, and the letter was believed by some people who had known Voss for 20 years and could not reconcile what they were hearing with the man they thought they knew. That part was the hardest to watch, not the legal maneuvering, which Caleb understood and could work against. The harder thing was the people who didn't want to know, the ones who had built a version of Harlan Voss that served some need in them, the proof that wealth and standing and a good reputation meant a man was genuinely good, and who resisted revising it not because they supported what he'd done, but because revising it cost them something. It cost them the comfortable story. And comfortable stories are not given up easily, no matter what replaces them. Caleb had seen it before. He had never stopped finding it difficult. Ruth Alderman was found on the 14th day. Caleb had sent a letter to every postmaster in the larger towns of Colorado, addressed to a woman named Ruth Alderman, care of a son named Daniel Alderman. It was a long shot, the kind of long shot you take when you've run out of better ones. He had not expected it to work, which is perhaps why it did. 10 days after he sent the letters, a reply came from a postmaster in a town called Fairview, Colorado, saying that a Ruth Alderman had called at his office and wished to know who was asking after her and why. He wrote back immediately. He explained who he was, what he was building, and what he needed. He told her about Lily. He told her about the hearing in Rollins and what her testimony would mean for the case against both Voss and Aldridge. He told her the truth about what she would be walking back into because she deserved to know exactly what she was being asked to do. Her reply came 6 days later, 4 days before the hearing. It was 1 page. The handwriting was the same cramped, careful hand he recognized from the Laramie complaint. She had not changed the way she wrote in the years since. She said she had read his letter 3 times. She said she had talked to her son Daniel, who was against it initially, and then for it after she'd explained what had happened to the child she'd been caring for. She said she had not slept properly since September of last year, and she believed this was why, and that she had decided the only thing worse than coming back would be not coming back. She arrived in Rollins the night before the hearing on the stage from Denver, and Caleb met her at the stage office with Evelyn Shaw, who had insisted on coming and whom Caleb had not argued with because he had learned in the past months that arguing with Evelyn Shaw was an investment of time that did not pay returns. Ruth Alderman was smaller than he'd expected, or maybe she had just gotten smaller in the years since she'd left Calhoun County. She had gray-brown hair and tired eyes, and she looked at Caleb when she stepped off the stage and said, without preamble, "Is Lily all right?" "She is," he said. Something in Ruth Alderman's face unlocked, just slightly, just enough. "Good," she said. "That's the main thing." Evelyn took her to the hotel, and Caleb went back to the room he'd taken for the night and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about what the next day was going to require. He was not nervous in the way that makes people's hands shake. He was nervous in the way that makes everything very clear and very present, which was the useful kind. He thought about Lily back at the ranch with Marcus. He had told her he'd be back the day after tomorrow. She had nodded and said okay, and then said, after a pause, "Tell the judge everything," as if he might have considered telling him less. He had said he would, and she had gone back to her letters, which she could now write in full without looking at the example he'd set for her, her name and 3 others she'd taught herself from the notebook's margins. Lily, Caleb, Marcus. She had been working on Evelyn, which was harder because of the repeated letters, and had declared the second E unreasonable, which was a fair assessment. He thought about her learning to read, about the first morning she had eaten breakfast without watching the door, about the afternoon she had laughed, actually laughed, without catching herself, at something Biscuit did in the yard, a short, surprise sound that seemed to startle her as much as it startled him. He thought about Thomas, which he did less often now than he used to, and in a different way, not with the gutting absence that had characterized the first years, but with the steadier ache that was simply part of the permanent landscape of him. Thomas had been 6 when he died, old enough to be himself, to have preferences and jokes and the particular way he ate his breakfast that Caleb could still see clearly when he tried. He didn't try as often anymore. It still hurt. He expected it always would, in the specific way that things that are genuinely irreversible always hurt. Not less, exactly, but differently. Carried instead of crushing. He had not told Lily about Thomas. There would be time for that, eventually, or there wouldn't be. And either way, it wasn't what she needed right now. What she needed right now was stability and continuity, and to know that the same person who had opened the door on that December night was going to keep being the person who opened the door. He intended to keep being that person. The hearing began at 9 in the morning in Judge Holt's court, which was a room that managed to be both smaller and more authoritative than Caleb had pictured. Plain walls, good light from tall windows, and Holt at the bench with his large hands folded and his independent eyebrows doing their work on anyone who appeared before him. Voss was there, with Arthur Price beside him, and for the first time since this had started, Caleb saw Voss in a room where his wealth and his reputation were not doing the work he'd relied on them to do. He was still well-dressed. He still sat with the posture of a man accustomed to being deferred to. But the gray eyes that had done their reading across the table at the Continental Hotel were doing less certain work in this room, and Price was leaning toward him and speaking in a low voice with the slightly too careful manner of a lawyer managing a client who is not taking advice well. Caleb sat at the opposing table with Marshall Creed beside him and the 47-page file in a stack in front of him and waited for Holt to begin. Holt began by addressing the room without preamble. "This is a territorial proceeding under my authority as senior circuit judge. The rules of this court apply and no others. Anyone who has a different understanding of what is happening today is invited to correct that understanding now." He looked at Price. Price said nothing. "Good." The evidence was entered first. The medical documentation from Evelyn Shaw, who sat in the witnesses' area with her hands folded and her dark eyes steady. Clara Whitlock's notes, properly authenticated. The full statements from Nora Greer, Gary Tibbs, and Wade Parker. The forged county document with the recorder's log discrepancy clearly annotated, and the correspondence with the Federal Circuit showing the connection between the Society and the suspended Laramie inquiry. Price objected to 4 items and was overruled on 3. The fourth, a question about the authentication of the recorder's log, Holt took seriously for approximately 4 minutes before the Territorial Recorder's Office representative, who had been subpoenaed and was sitting in the corner looking as though he'd rather be somewhere warmer, confirmed the discrepancy in the entry numbers from his own records. "Objection overruled," Holt said, and moved on. Clara Whitlock testified for 40 minutes. She was not a dramatic witness. She did not cry, and she did not raise her voice, and she did not say anything she hadn't already written down. What she was completely unshakable. Price cross-examined her for 20 minutes and could not find a gap in anything she said because there were no gaps. She had observed what she had observed. She had written it down at the time. The dates were consistent. The details were consistent. There was nothing to attack. Nora Greer was more visibly afraid, and her voice shook in the first 10 minutes, and then it didn't. The moment it steadied, somewhere around the point where she described the day Henry was taken away in the wagon, the room got quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sound, and everything to do with the kind of attention that settles on a space when something true is being said in it. Gary Tibbs testified to what he'd seen in Aldridge's satchel. He was not, by nature or practice, a courtroom witness. He shifted in the chair and used too many words for simple things and had to be redirected twice. But the substance of what he said landed the way it needed to, which was as first-hand confirmation that the Placement Society maintained operational records on children in terms that no legitimate welfare organization would use. Parker testified last, before Ruth Alderman, and it was the most difficult testimony to sit through. Not because of what he said, which was comprehensive and damning and precisely what Caleb needed, but because of what it cost him to say it. He spoke about 12 years of looking away and making accommodations and telling himself a story about what his job required of him, and he did not look for sympathy and did not find any, and he kept going anyway. He named every instance where he had acted on Voss's instruction rather than his own oath. He described the false court order he had carried to Caleb's door. He described other orders, other occasions, other things done or not done at Voss's direction across 12 years of complicity. When Price stood to cross-examine, he said, "Sheriff Parker, are you aware that what you have just testified to implicates you in multiple instances of—" "Yes," Parker said. "I'm aware." He looked at his hands. "I figured it would." Price sat back down, and then Ruth Alderman took the chair. She was not what the room had been expecting, and the room's expectations had been recalibrated several times already. She sat down and looked at Holt and said, in a voice that was quiet but carried fully, "I worked in Harlan Voss's household for 9 months, from December to September. I cared for the child Lily during that period. I kept records because I was worried about what I was seeing and I didn't know what else to do." She talked for an hour and 10 minutes. She talked about Lily and about the systematic nature of what she'd witnessed, and about her own fear and the choice she'd made to file the complaint in Laramie after she'd left, and what had happened when the witnesses she'd hoped would support her had gone quiet, one by one, in the particular way that people go quiet in a county where one man controls too many variables. She talked about going to Colorado and sleeping badly, and the conversation with her son Daniel that had been the hardest conversation she'd had since leaving. "I knew from the beginning," she said near the end, "that what was happening to that child was wrong. I knew it the first week, and I stayed for 9 months because I told myself that my being there was better for her than my leaving. But the truth—" She paused, and her voice did the thing that voices do when they're carrying something heavy and have decided to carry it anyway. "The truth is that I stayed because leaving was frightening, and speaking up was more frightening, and I was a woman alone without a great deal of options, and those are real things, and I'm not going to pretend they weren't, but they weren't good enough reasons. I knew that when I left. I know it now." The room was very quiet. "I'm here," she said, "because a man I'd never met opened his door at midnight in December and took care of a little girl who had walked 8 miles in the snow barefoot. And I thought about that, and I thought about what it would mean if I let that be the whole story, if I let him do the hard part and I stayed home because it was safer." She looked at her hands. "I decided I couldn't do that." Price did not cross-examine Ruth Alderman. He leaned over and spoke quietly to Voss, and Voss's jaw tightened, and Price shook his head once and stayed in his seat. Holt recessed for 30 minutes and came back with a written ruling that he read aloud into the record in full, which took 11 minutes. The ruling covered multiple determinations, each one delivered in the same level, declarative tone, without drama or flourish, because Holt was not a dramatic man, and the facts didn't require drama. The guardianship arrangement between Harlan Voss and the child known as Lily was terminated immediately and permanently on the grounds that it had been obtained through a fraudulent organizational structure and maintained through abuse of the child's person. The Calhoun County Welfare and Placement Society was ordered dissolved, its records seized and transferred to the Territorial Attorney's Office, and its activities declared in violation of territorial statutes governing child welfare. The forged county record was referred to the Territorial Attorney for criminal prosecution. Harlan Voss was remanded to federal custody pending criminal charges on multiple counts, including child abuse, conspiracy to defraud, and subornation of official misconduct. Edmund Aldridge, already in custody in Cheyenne, faced the same charges plus additional counts related to the organizational operation of the society across multiple counties. The matter of Wade Parker was referred separately to a panel that would determine appropriate disciplinary and legal consequences, with Holt noting on the record that Parker's voluntary and comprehensive testimony had been a significant factor in the proceeding's outcome. Holt finished reading and looked up. "This court is adjourned," he said. "Thank you all for your conduct today." He left. The room exhaled. Caleb sat at the table for a moment after it was over. He was aware of movement around him. Creed speaking to his deputies, Price gathering his papers, the room resettling itself into ordinary space. He was aware of Evelyn Shaw appearing at his elbow and saying, "Well," in the tone of someone who has just watched something she wasn't sure she'd ever see. And he was aware of Ruth Alderman standing near the door, looking at nothing in particular with the expression of a woman who has put down something she's been carrying a long time and hasn't quite worked out yet what to do with her hands. He stood. He went to Ruth Alderman and said, "Thank you." She looked at him. "How is she really?" "She's learning to write," he said. She argued with me last week about whether the letter E was worth the effort. Ruth Alderman looked at him for a moment, and her face did something that was partway between laughing and something else. And she said, "That sounds like her." He rode back to the ranch the next afternoon, arriving in the late afternoon light that came low and gold across the snow-covered ground. The light that made even the scorched corner of the barn look less like damage and more like something that had survived something, which was what it was. Marcus was at the gate, which meant he had been watching for some time. He looked at Caleb, and Caleb nodded once, and Marcus closed his eyes briefly and then opened them and said, "Good," in the particular way Marcus said good when he meant considerably more than that. "Where is she?" Caleb asked. "Inside. She's been at the table since noon, working on that E." He went inside. Lily was at the kitchen table with a page covered in attempts at Evelyn, varying wildly in size and accuracy. And when he came in, she looked up and looked at his face and did her reading of it. "Done?" she asked. "Done," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at the page. Then she said, without looking up, "Did the judge understand everything?" "He understood all of it," Caleb said. She nodded. She picked up the pencil. She drew the E again, this time slower, as if whatever she'd been holding while he was gone had released enough that she had more attention for the letter. It was better than the previous attempts. Not perfect, but better, which was generally how things went. He sat across from her and put his coat over the back of the chair and watched her work. "Caleb?" she said after a while. "Yeah." She kept her eyes on the page. "Could I stay here? After everything?" She paused. "I mean, not just until it's settled. I mean, after." He had thought about this question. He had thought about it in Rawlins the night before the hearing, and on the road coming back, and in the 16 years before any of this happened that had led him to a ranch in Wyoming 12 miles from anywhere. He had thought about whether he was the right kind of person to answer yes to it, whether a man who had spent 4 years building a life around absence was capable of building one around presence instead. He thought he was. He wasn't certain. Certainty was not something he'd ever had in great supply, and what he'd learned in the past months was that you could do the right thing without being certain. You just had to be willing. Willing was something he had. "Yes," he said, "you can stay." She looked up. She was checking his face for the version that adults put on when they say the thing they think a child needs to hear, and he let her check because she had every right to check. He meant it, and his face knew it, and after a moment she knew it too. She looked back down at the page. She finished the E. She held it up. It was still lopsided. The vertical line was slightly short, and the 3 horizontal lines were not quite parallel. It was recognizably, unmistakably, an E. "Better," he said. "It's still not right," she said. "No," he said, "but it's better. That's the direction you want to go." She considered this. Then she put the pencil down and looked at the page, and he had the sense, watching her, of something he couldn't quite name but which had something to do with time. With the particular quality of moments that don't announce themselves as significant, but which, when you look back at them later, turn out to have been exactly the pivot point, the place where one thing became another thing. He had spent years understanding what he had lost. He had been thorough about it, exhaustive, in the way that grief can become its own kind of occupation. He had come to Wyoming to be alone with that understanding, and he had been very effectively alone with it. And then a child had knocked at his door at midnight, and the project of loss had slowly, almost without his noticing, become something else. Not replacement. That was the thing people got wrong about this kind of thing. The assumption that new love cancels old grief, that a new child must mean you've gotten over the child you lost. That was not how it worked. Thomas was still Thomas, and the loss of him was still the specific, irreversible thing it had always been. Lily was Lily, which was different and complete in itself. There was room for both. He hadn't known that before. He knew it now. The life he was living was not the one he would have chosen. You don't choose the version of your life that comes after the thing that breaks you. That version is assembled from what's left and what arrives and what you're willing to do with your hands when they've healed enough to work again. It is imperfect by design. It is full of things you didn't plan on and complications you didn't anticipate, and a barn that now needed significant structural repair on the southeast corner. and a 4-year-old girl who found the letter E unreasonable, and who had walked 8 miles in the snow on her own 2 feet because she had decided at the age of 4 that she was worth more than what she had been given, and who had turned out to be exactly right about that. He got up and put the coffee on and started making dinner. Marcus came in from the cold with snow on his hat and hung it by the door and sniffed the air and said, "What are we having?" "What's in the kitchen?" Caleb said. "Ah," Marcus said, and sat down. Lily was still at the table, adding a second name to the page below Evelyn. She was writing slowly and carefully, and the letters came out uneven but deliberate, one after another, and when she finished, she held the page up without being asked. "Caleb," it said, with an A that leaned left and an E that was still arguing about its horizontal lines, and a B that was trying its best. His name, in her handwriting, on a page covered in her work, in a kitchen that smelled like coffee, in something being cooked, in a house that was no longer only the house where he was alone. "There," she said. "There," he agreed. Outside, the wind had gentled to something almost reasonable. The mountains to the north were still the mountains, enormous and permanent and utterly indifferent to what happened below them, which was actually one of the things Caleb had always liked about them. They didn't require anything. They just stood there, which was enough. The barn needed work. The case against Edmund Aldridge would take months to move through the territorial courts and would require additional testimony and would not always go cleanly, because nothing did. Ruth Alderman had gone back to Colorado, but had written her address in his notebook with an instruction to contact her if more was needed, and he expected more would be needed, and he expected she would come. There was a boy named Henry in or near Goshen who Caleb had written to the federal marshal's office about. A separate matter, a harder one, with no guaranteed outcome, only the obligation to try. There was a great deal of work still ahead. There always was. That was the thing about deciding to be present in the world rather than adjacent to it. The world did not simplify itself in gratitude. It remained exactly as complicated as it had always been. It just mattered more. Caleb put dinner on the table and Marcus poured water, and Lily put her pages in a careful stack at the edge of the table, away from the plates, and they sat down together in the way they had been sitting down together for weeks now, which was without ceremony and without commenting on it, because the things that have actually become ordinary don't require acknowledgement. The things that are real just are. He had learned that once, and forgotten it, and learned it again in the hardest possible way, and now he intended to hold on to it. Not with both hands, clenched, just the way you hold things that matter, with enough grip to keep them, and enough sense to know that what you're holding is alive, and therefore not entirely yours, and that's the whole point. He passed the bread to Lily. She took a piece and broke it in half and offered the other half to Marcus, which was a thing she had started doing recently, the small, instinctive gestures of a child, learning that there are tables where the food doesn't run out, where no one will take your portion, where you are allowed to give something away and still have enough. Some lessons take years, some take longer, some, if you're fortunate, you learn just barely in time. Caleb ate his dinner and listened to Marcus talk about the barn repairs, and watched Lily process the engineering logic of fixing a roof with the focused attention she brought to everything. And the evening came down around the house the way evenings do. Gradually, and then completely. And the lamp was lit, and the fire was burning, and the mountains outside were doing what mountains do. It was enough. After everything, it was more than enough.